Yes, I can share my screen. Okay.
Okay. Okay, again, thank you very much for joining our session in our Global Professional Program Excellence and Research and Teaching. And today with us, our guest speaker today is Dr. Paul Chiambaretto, Associate Professor of Marketing and Strategy at Montpellier Business School. Actually, Dr. Chiambaretto works at three positions, as I do understand: Associate Researcher at Ecole Polytechnique, where he gets a PhD in Management, and I'm sorry, what is the third position of yours?
So you had Montpellier Business School and the Chaire Pégase as well.
Okay. And what else is more, for me, Paul was the gate opener in terms of competition strategy research, because I met you, I remember, in 2015, the first time when I arrived laboratory of Coopetition at the University of Montpellier, supervised by Frédéric Leroy, who is the best the representative of this competition floor in France, I think, in my opinion, of course. But nevertheless, that Frédéric Leroy is the head of the laboratory. I know that you are in top 10 contributors in terms of papers in competition. I always admire of your devotion and inspiration that you share with the social media, with TV channels about co-opetition, and the how powerful these research and the mindset can be for industries. And that's why I'm very happy and honored to have you as a guest speaker, and I hope my participants will enjoy this session as well. Thank you very much, and the stage is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this very nice introduction. I am the one who is actually very honored to be invited to be part of this seminar slash lecture with all of you. And I know that it's quite challenging from some of you who are not exactly on the same time zone as us in Europe. So for the ones for which it's like almost very late in the night or very early in the morning, congratulations for being with us today. I will quickly just share my screen so that you can actually, I don't know, see okay. So I will just quickly introduce myself, and so that you understand a bit better who I am, and then I will try to explain you a bit better what we do. Can you see my screen with the slides?
Yes, we do see your screens. Yeah, the screen is fine.
And you have like the full screen on the slide right now?
No, we see your PowerPoint in a process.
Okay, that's strange. It should not be the case. Or worst case scenario, I will just share my entire screen. The joys of Teams. I will share my entire screen that time, and that should be better.
Works fine. Yeah.
Perfect. Good. Okay. So as I was saying, thank you for this invitation. So just so that you understand a bit better who I am, even if Anna already introduced me. So my name is Paul Chiambaretto. I'm an associate professor of strategic management at Montpellier Business School, so in the south of France, close to the Mediterranean Sea. And I'm also an associate researcher at Ecole Polytechnique in Paris. And I've been studying alliances and co-opetition over the last 10, 12 years, more or less. And it's a very interesting topic that I will try to introduce you to in the next minutes, hours. And I'll try to highlight what is co-opetition, what are its current challenges, current debates also in the existing literature, and also the main research directions. So the current debates that we have, and also the topics that are not completely addressed right now. So that's more or less the agenda for today. But before doing this, I would like just to know you a bit better, and more precisely, just to understand what are your expectations, if you want, about this seminar, and also what is your current knowledge of co-opetition. So to do this, let's switch to another screen, and there it goes. So if you have your computer or anything like this, you just have to go on the website www.menti.com, or you can do this also with your cell phone, and then you type the code 83231963. And of course, as you can guess, there's no right or wrong answer. It's much more for me to understand how comfortable you feel about co-opetition, if you understand what it is or not, if it's one of your current research topics or not at all, if it's something that you would like to work on in the future, and so on. So I don't know if it works for you. By the way, while you are doing this, I also have access to the chat in parallel. So if you have any question, just feel free to interrupt me or to ask a question directly in the chat. I will try to answer live if you have any question on it. Okay, so far we have 3 answers. Okay, let's go up to 10 and then I'll continue. And of course, I'm sure that it will probably change. Okay, so I understand quite well what co-opetition is, and apparently, so we've like around 3.3 out of 5. So you seem to understand quite well what co-opetition is. So we'll spend some time at the beginning just to come back on the definitions of co-opetition and to understand whether the cases you're investigating in your research are actually cases of co-opetition. And you will see that even academics that dedicate a big part of their time on co-opetition, they do not always agree on what is co-opetition. So we'll try to understand the key elements of the debate. Not so many of you are currently working on co-opetition, but a bit more plan to do research about co-opetition in the future. So I'll try also to pinpoint the different research directions that are important to address for future research. Okay, let's move on to the second question. So keep having the menti.com website on your computer. So what do you actually expect from this presentation? Just in one sentence, do you want like, it's just for me to make sure that I try to give you elements that are useful or that are at least in line with your expectations. And again, there's no right or wrong answers about it. Insights, cases, new understanding. Okay, to develop like new skills through this new concept. New ideas. I'll do my best to provide you new ideas and insights for your research. Amazing real-life stories with examples. Okay, so I understand examples. Perfect. And actually, we'll start with examples so that to show you that co-opetition is almost everywhere. Okay, to know more about the topic, to understand what the concept is, and see how you can use it for your research. Perfect. To learn something new, okay, to understand better what co-opetition is. New point of view. That's a super interesting question. Whether co-opetition benefits to all stakeholders or only like some of these stakeholders. Consider co-opetition strategies in humanities. Okay, so in other disciplines, that management, which is currently a big topic for us. So about co-opetition in general and how it could understand how I can operate during writing of my thesis, yes. Okay, so I think we have some very interesting expectations, so I hope I will meet them by the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's actually go back to my slides. Okay, do you have them in full screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. So maybe let's start by trying to see why it is actually important to talk about co-opetition. And maybe the best way to talk about co-opetition is through examples, at least to see that co-opetition is a very pervasive practice, a very pervasive strategy for firms. Did you know that actually when you buy a Sony LCD television, it has actually been jointly developed with Samsung, one of its strongest competitors? So the idea of this set of examples is to show you that actually many firms in very different industries rely on co-opetition strategies. So co-opetition, this idea of like alliances between competitors. So Sony and Samsung, for instance, for many years, they have like jointly developed many TV screens. And when you were buying a Sony television or Samsung television, actually inside that technology was the same. And the standard, the technology was jointly developed by these two firms. We have the same kind of behavior, for instance, in the satellite manufacturing industry. One of the largest special projects, for instance, YesSat, has jointly been developed by two key competitors, Astrium, that was the subsidiary of Airbus Defence and Space, and also Thales. So these two very large competing firms, competing satellite manufacturers, they have decided to work together, for instance, to create this very large spatial project. So it's something that is very present, for instance, in the spatial industry. But it's also the same thing when you decide to buy a house or an apartment. For instance, in France, real estate agencies have created something called the Fichier MEPI that actually put together the listings of the different real estate agencies. And actually more than 40% of houses and apartments sold in France are sold jointly by competing real estate agencies. Talking back about Samsung, you know that Samsung and Apple are fierce competitors for smartphones, okay? But did you know that actually many parts of your iPhone are actually provided by Samsung? Even the operating system, the iOS, is actually co-developed with Samsung engineers. So when you buy an iPhone, actually, you are mostly buying parts from Samsung. So this relationship in terms of competition between these two giants in terms of technology is very different. You have the same type of relationship also in the biopharmaceutical industry. You have like some very large pharmaceutical successes like the Plavix that works for the earth conditions, the earth conditions, sorry. Well, it's the result of a collaboration, for instance, between two of the largest pharmaceutical firms, BMS and Sanofi. They are strongly competing, and at the same time, they are cooperating to launch or to develop new drugs. And as you can guess, with the COVID-19 crisis, you had many cooperations like this between very large pharmaceutical firms. But it also works in the service industry. Think about airlines. Around 60% of Air France's alliances are signed with competitors. So you see, co-opetition, the fact that competitors work together, it's something that appears in many industries. It can be used in very different industries and with very different types of firms. Small firms, large firms, they all have an incitation, an incentive to actually work with their competitor. And in addition, coopetition is a fascinating research topic. It's actually a growing research topic. There's a lot of research that has been published on coopetition over the last decades. I will come back on this. And there's a growing interest. Actually, there are more and more people that switch from strategic alliances to coopetition over time. And so it's a booming concept, and it's quite interesting to understand what it is about. Of course, there are scholars from across the globe that work on this topic, and we'll come back a bit later. So we wrote a book with some colleagues from Montpellier and also from Poland. And we gathered in this handbook called the Routledge Companion to Co-opetition Strategies, different chapters from the best scholars across the globe on co-opetition. I will talk a bit more about this book at the very end of my presentation. And so there's this kind of growing community about co-opetition, and they cite each other, they discuss with each other, and there's this growing interest, this common interest to develop this concept. And of course, this community also meets physically. I mean, ideally, you don't, I mean, right now it's a bit complex, but we meet from time to time, several times a year actually, in different conferences. And so we have created specific dedicated tracks within, for instance, the European Academy of Management Conference called the SINA track, in which we put together researchers that work on co-opetition, ecosystems, networks, and alliances. And if it is something that is interesting to you, you just go on Facebook and you type SINA community, and we have like a page in which we post the different the latest works of researchers. So every time you publish a research article on alliances, for instance, on co-opetition ecosystems, you can share it with the community so that these scholars that are interested in this topic actually read it. So this is why I wanted to talk about co-opetition, and I thank once again Anna for this amazing opportunity. So let's talk about the outline of the presentation. And one of the questions that some of you raised was, I would like to know a bit more about coopetition, what it is not. And some of you were not completely sure about whether your cases, your empirical setting was about coopetition. So we'll try to define a bit better what is coopetition and so on. Of course, the question is, why are there so many firms that use coopetition? So what are the benefits associated to coopetition? How can I take some value out of it? So we'll try to understand the drivers, more or less, of coopetition. Of course, you'll see that coopetition is a kind of tricky strategy because you'll have to collaborate and compete at the same time, and so it kind of generates tensions for firms. And so the question is, how do we manage these tensions? And you will see that there are different principles that are available to firms to make sure that you transform coopetition into a kind of win-win strategy. Then the question is, okay, it seems to work. It's difficult to manage, but we can manage it. But is it always a good strategy to reach higher levels of performance? And is it the case for all of the different, let's say, stakeholders? So we'll try to understand the performance implications of co-opetition in this last part, in this part number 4. And finally, we'll try to go beyond the existing stock of research regarding co-opetition, and we'll try to see what are the current debates about co-opetition and the main research directions in the field. I hope this agenda is in line with your expectations. And again, if you have like any question, just feel free to send me a message in the chat. Okay, so let's talk about co-opetition and let's try to define it, because I think it's one of the most challenging things right now in the community. Well, first, before defining co-opetition, it's important to make a kind of mental shift in your mind. And very often, and mostly for Europeans, we are used to categorize things in boxes, okay? And when something is in one box, it's not in the other box. And we have this vision that cooperation and competition are two different boxes. And I would say that even that competition and cooperation are like the two extremes of a continuum. And so you say, well, the more I compete with someone, the less I cooperate with this person. By contrast, the more I cooperate with this person, the less I compete with him. You see, it's like the way we tend to think usually. But let's just wait 2 minutes and think about this relationship between Apple and Samsung. They compete a lot, and at the same time, they cooperate a lot. So where should we actually locate competition, the Apple-Samsung relationship on this continuum? Because they compete a lot, you would say, yes, on the left side, great. But at the same time, they cooperate a lot on these parts, so maybe on the right side. And you see, we are completely, we struggle to categorize this kind of relationships in which you have like firms that compete a lot and cooperate a lot at the same time. And so the first thing we have to do is to understand that competition and cooperation are not the two extremes of a continuum. They are two independent dimensions. So they are not on the same axis. They are independent dimensions. Okay, so you have cooperation on one side, competition on the other side, and then you can locate any relationship on this area with these two independent dimensions. So this relationship, you will have a given degree of cooperation and another degree of competition. But you see that you can then locate any type of relationship, and you can have like a high level of competition and a high level of cooperation at the same time. So by doing this, actually it provides you the opportunity to categorize or to present co-opetition, if you want, or to categorize relationships along 3 types of relationships. You have what we would call the balanced relationships, in which you have more or less the same degree of cooperation and the same degree of competition. We don't cooperate so much and we don't compete so much. We are like coexisting without really taking care of the other. So that would be around in here, something like this. At the same time, I can also decide to compete a lot and cooperate a lot. So I would be on the upper part on the right of my figure. I would be somewhere around here. And then I can have like relationships that are more cooperation dominant. So we cooperate more than we compete. So that would be the green zone at the bottom of the figure. On the contrary, we can have a relationship that is more competition oriented. We compete much more than we cooperate. Okay, so that's the idea about trying to understand that to think about co-opetition, first we have to stop thinking about competition and cooperation as this two extremes, but as clearly real independent dimensions. Very important point. And so the question is, once we know this, how do we define competition? So the word coopetition has been, so to be completely honest, the first one to talk about coopetition was a manager. The guy is called Ray Norda. He was the CEO of Novell. And he talked about coopetition to characterize the fact that in the IT industry, firms were cooperating and competing at the same time. But, you know, when managers invent stuff, academics don't like it. And so they want to reinvent everything and recreate a word. And so the first one to really use coopetition from a more academic standpoint are two American researchers, Adam Brandenburger and Barry Nalbuff in 1996, and they published this book. And this book uses the term coopetition. They are inspired by game theory because they are both economists who are specialized in game theory. And they try to explain that sometimes it is in the interest of firms, of competing firms, to work together to create some value. It's great. This book becomes a bestseller, but in the entire book, you have absolutely no definition of coopetition. Surprising paradox. Anyway, so we have to wait a bit more and to have like a real proper definition that comes from Maria Bengtsson and Søren Koch. So Maria is from Sweden, Søren is from Finland, and they've been working together and they define in 2000 coopetition as a dyadic and paradoxical relationship that emerges when two firms cooperate in some activities, such as in a strategic alliance, and at the same time compete with each other in other activities. So what do we have to remember from this first definition? That coopetition is first a paradoxical relationship. Why? Because you have firms that cooperate in some activities and compete in other ones. And you see, they have like these very basic definitions in which they mostly think about two firms. Okay, so it's a dyadic relationship. It's great, it's interesting, but when they confront their definition to real cases, it happens that there's a kind of mismatch. And when there's a mismatch, it gives an opportunity for other researchers to actually create new definitions. So in the next decades, in the following decades, you will see other definitions of coopetition that emerge. For instance, you have this one by Danino and Padula in 2002 that say that coopetitions is the system of actors that interact on the basis of a partial congruence of interest and objectives. Very broad definition, but what really mattered to them was to say that actually there could be cases of coopetition between firms, between more than two firms actually, like between 3 firms, 4 firms, 10 firms, and so on. Again, the first definitions were about activities. It's great. But actually, the challenge was to say that maybe it's not only about activities on which you cooperate and activities on which you compete. There could be other definitions, a broader vision of coopetition. So you have like this highly cited definition, which is by David Niawali and Park in 2011, saying that coopetition is a strategy embodying simultaneous cooperation and competition between firms. I would say that the most cited one, or at least one of the most current definition, again by Bengtsson and Koch in 2014, is to say that it's a paradoxical relationship between 2 or more actors. So you see, they go from 2 actors and now they broaden the scope of coopetition. They keep the idea that these actors, they have to be simultaneously involved in cooperative and competitive interactions. And what they introduce, and it's quite interesting, is whether the relationship is horizontal or vertical. Because over the starting in 2010, you were people that were discussing whether coopetition could be applied to vertical relationship. And so they decided to encompass these new contributions by having these elements. And then it's one of our definitions that we published in 2019 with 2 other colleagues. We highlighted that the current definitions of co-opetition, they did not allow to define cases of co-opetition within the same firm. And there's an entire stream of literature about something called internal co-opetition. For instance, L'Oréal, one of these large firms that sells shampoos, cosmetics, and so on. They have many business units. These business units, they have their research and development in common, for instance. Sometimes they have the same ingredients, they have the same marketing teams, and so on. So they cooperate, but at the same time, these brands are in competition with one another. When you buy a brand of shampoo, you don't buy the other one. And so these brands, even if they belong to the same group, they compete with one another, and at the same time, they cooperate on other activities that are imposed by the group. So we needed to have a definition like this that would allow to take them into account. So I guess that after all these definitions, you must be completely confused. And don't worry, this is completely normal. Why? Because currently, you have a growing number of contributions about co-opetition. They have very different visions of co-opetition, sometimes in contradiction with one another. And sometimes you have some common features and other ones that have very different peculiarities. So you have all the ingredients to become completely crazy. And so my point is to make sure that in the end, you have a kind of checklist to make sure that the case you have in mind actually meets a set of conditions to make sure that it's actually a real case of co-opetition. And these 3 conditions, they are actually based on a paper we work with 2 colleagues, Frédéric Leroy and Anne-Sophie Fernandez. It's currently under review, so I cannot share it with you, but it's a paper in which we try to define some key conditions for which a case is actually a case of co-opetition. So, condition number 1. Co-opetition requires intense competition between the partnering firms. What does it mean? It means that competition first differs from conflict. That is often used in some co-opetition papers. Competition means that you have economic actors, firms, business units, organizations, and they struggle because they target the same customers. So it means that to be in presence of co-opetition, first you need to make sure that the organizations you are looking at, they are targeting the same customers. They have a market overlap. Second, competition has to be intense by opposition to limited. And so when you see this, I'm sure that in your mind you are thinking, okay, but how should we measure it? So you have different approaches, measuring the number of common SIC codes, for instance, or WIPO categories. WIPO is for intellectual property or brand names, for instance. Another way to measure competition is cross elasticity. When the price of one product increases, it will finally increase the demand of the competitive product. You can also look at it from the competitive aggressiveness perspective. Is it a question also of cognitive categorization? Do firms consider another firm as their competitor, for instance? So you have many different ways. What really matters is to think about these market overlaps. Firms are in competition if they are targeting the same customers and if there is a significant market overlap. These are 2 firms, firm blue and firm red, if you want. And you see that they meet between these 2 circles. And so the intersection between the 2 circles is the market overlap. And look at these 2 firms. You see that the scope, the size of the market overlap is completely different. And you understand that the 2 firms at the bottom are more competitors, or at least the competition is more intense between these 2 firms than the 2 firms at the top. So it's very important to be in presence of competition between the 2 firms, and this competition has to be intense. Otherwise, you're just in front of an alliance between 2 firms. So competition requires that your partnering firms are competitors. Okay, that's condition number one. Condition number two, co-opetition requires also intense cooperation between these firms. And so, well, I'm sure that you all know that coordination, collaboration, and cooperation are like pervasive strategies between organizations, again. But again, cooperation has to be intense. And you have many papers that actually say, okay, we have two competing firms and they vaguely cooperate on a tiny activity. No, in that case, it's not co-opetition. The cooperation has to be strategic. So how could we measure it? It's like, for instance, the number of resources exchanged or shared between these two competitors, or the share of the cooperation in the total turnover. The idea is to say that, well, it's not only a question of quantity. The thing is that the resources shared, they have to be critical. They have to be important. And it's the only way actually to generate real synergies. So, intense competition between the firms, intense cooperation between the firms, and the last element, cooperation and competition, have to be simultaneous. Very important, okay? Strong competition, strong cooperation, and both have to happen at the same time. The key thing is that co-opetition builds upon this combination of cooperative and competitive behaviors. And these behaviors, they have to happen at the same time. Why? There's currently, and I just talk about it because it's important, but there's currently a debate with some other scholars who say that co-opetition sometimes they don't have to be simultaneous. I'm part of the scholars that are quite strict on this, that say that to be in presence of co-opetition, you need cooperation and competition to happen at the same time. And the thing is that it's a key driver of performance. It's because you are at the same time a competitor and a partner that you want to outperform your partner. You want to be better. Let's say that we are simply cooperating without being competitors at the same time. Okay, so we cooperate, we have a joint project, we create a car together. That's great. We make a decent car, we try to sell it on the market, we split the benefits. That's great. Now, let's say that these two firms, instead of being pure partners, at the same time they are competitors. It means that, okay, they will share resources to develop this new car, but at the same time, they will keep some resources, financial resources, technological resources, engineers, and so on, to make sure that this common car, they will improve it, each partner on their side, and to make sure that they have like a better product than the one of their partner. And it's because you're a competitor that you want to be better than the other firm that has co-developed a car. So you always want to do something better than the other one. And it's this pressure to outperform your competitor that generates this superior performance. And if you only alternate phases of cooperation and competition, you don't have like this tension, this incentive to be better. So this is why you have to compete and cooperate simultaneously. Okay, so remember 3 key conditions: intense competition, intense cooperation, and both of them have to be simultaneous. Are we good so far? Are there any questions maybe in the chat before going to the following one?
So if I have one, may I?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So if we have some different phases, for instance, we compete and then we cooperate, and then we compete and then cooperate. There is a competition or not?
Strictly speaking, it's not competition in that case. it's what they call interplay of cooperation and competition, in which you alternate phases. Coopetition really works when you have like the two behaviors at the same time. It's because coopetition works only if you have like this kind of tension that forces you to outperform a friend. That's the tricky thing. This is of cooperation and competition. In that case, you don't have this incentive to be better. When you are like fully cooperating, you say, okay, I cooperate, everything goes smoothly, and suddenly you will compete only. And if you compete only, you don't have incentive to be nice with the other one. And then you will cooperate again. And so you will have no incentive to outperform and so on. It's only when you have like the two things at the same time that it will create a lot of pressure to be better. And this what makes coopetition a superior strategy. It's the fact that you have like this pressure to always outperform someone with which you have created joint value. I don't know if it answers your question, Hannah.
It's perfectly fits my question. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, so why would firms prefer coopetition over entering a strategic alliance? That's a very interesting question, Janice. Actually, it relates to the fact that, so all the papers, the ones on coopetition and performance, actually they show that coopetition generates more performance than simple strategic alliances. Why? Because in a strategic alliance, you are like putting resources together, and that's great. You are creating synergies, new resource combinations, but you don't have this incentive again to be better than your partner. Coopetition works better than strategic alliances because you have this threat of being outperformed by your competitor. And so you don't want to give your partner the entire slice of the cake. I will show you this next slide, and I'm sure it will probably help you understand a bit better. And if I haven't, Janice, just let me know, and I'll try to make sure that I answer your question. So in 1996, in their book, Brandenburger and Nalbert, they create the metaphor of the cake. So if you were about to have dinner, you will be hungry with this. I'm very sorry, but let's talk about cakes. So these are two firms, the blue one and the white one, okay? And let's say that these circles like this, they represent their markets, okay? So I have like a $10 million market on my side. My competitor has a $10 million of his side, and we are like working separately and everything goes quite well. The idea of coopetition is to say that firms, they will cooperate together to increase the size of a common cake. This is what we call the value creation phase. Okay, so you cooperate, for instance, with a competitor to develop a new technology or to develop a new standard. We work together, for instance, think about Sony and Samsung, the example I gave you at the beginning. They decided to work together to create this LCD standard, to create this new standard for televisions. And none of them could have done this alone. So they needed to work together to put the resources, the know-how, the technologies, to be able to create this new standard, this new technology. That's great. The question is then, where is competition in it? Actually, competition, in that case, it will not increase the size of your cake, but it will increase the size of your slice in this common cake you have created. So for instance, I will customize this common technology to make my product more attractive than the one of my competitors. And so coopetition works because actually the slice, let's say even the white one, the white slice in this common cake is larger than my tiny white cake at the beginning on the left. Okay? And then there's an interesting dilemma that I want to pinpoint. The more you cooperate, the larger the size of the cake. But the more you compete, the larger the slice within this common cake. And so the question is, okay, I have a $100 million budget. Okay, it's a huge budget. Among this budget, how much budget should I allocate to the cooperation to increase the size of the cake? And how much budget should I keep for myself to make sure that I have the largest slice? If I invest my $100 million, I will have a huge cake, but actually I will have nothing left to have a slice in this cake. By contrast, if I keep everything to myself, it's great because I will have a huge slice, but I have a tiny cake. So you see, it's about trying to find this subtle balance. And I explain it like this with a cake, but you will see that Coopetition is always about trying to find this balance, about value creation on one side and value capture on the other side. And that's a super interesting tension to think about. So in strategic alliances, in that case, you will have like a cake like this. To answer your question, Janice, so you will create a cake, but in the end for your firm, the split of the cake will be predetermined in the contract of the strategic alliance. And you will not have this incentive to be better than the other one. And you know that consumers, they want the best products. So if you don't have the incentive to be better than your competitor, in that case, you will offer a product that is average. And so it's the combination of like these two behaviors that make actually co-opetition more interesting from a performance standpoint. Of course, co-opetition presents additional benefits in an innovation context. So it gives you, as in a strategic alliance, access to external resources and knowledge. I am not able to do this innovation project by myself. I will work with my competitor to have access to these resources. And actually, why do you do this with a competitor? It's because the resources you are looking for in terms of technology, in terms of know-how, usually the firm that has these missing resources are firms that address the same kind of needs as yours. And the firm that address the same kind of needs as yours are your competitors. Who knows better than my competitor what is needed by my market and my consumers? This is why actually you have the best partner to get the most relevant resources are your competitors. A second point, again, as in strategic alliances, is that it will allow you to share risks and cost of innovations. Why did we have so many co-opetition agreements in the last months to develop vaccines? Because developing a vaccine for the COVID-19 or for any type of disease is very costly. And it's very risky as well because it might not work. And so you need to share risks to divide the cost of innovation. And there is only one type of firm that wants to address the same need. Again, it's your competitor. Super interesting element also, these learning opportunities. When you have a competitive agreement, you will have the opportunity to learn from your competitor. It will give you access to new know-how, new technologies. And so for you, when you look for a partner, one of the things you are looking for is also the fact that through this agreement, I will be able to develop new skills, new technologies, and so on. So Coopetition will provide you interesting learning opportunities. This is the, let's say, positive side of the coin. On the contrary, you can see that the competitor on the other side does not always want you to learn from him because he's your competitor and you don't want to strengthen the competitor. So it will create an interesting tension that we will talk about in the next slide. And then reduce the time to market. That's super interesting, but it's this idea that, of course, when you put like resources together from firms that have exactly the same type of resources, needs, they know what are the expectations, you can do things very, very quickly. Last year, for instance, Google and Apple, for instance, they work together, again, against the COVID-19 pandemic to make sure that they would be able to create common standards to make sure that we would be able to track patients that have COVID. So instead of doing everything on a side, well, they decided to join forces and to say, okay, instead of creating two standards, two competing standards, maybe we should simply create one, and we should put together our engineers to make sure that we create something relevant in a very short amount of time. So we so I've like listed the different kind of benefits, and last year we published with some Swedish colleagues a research about the benefits that firms look for when they compete. So it was like an experimental setting and so on, and we draw distinctions between small firms and large firms, and we have been able to identify the attributes that matter the most when they select a competitor to innovate. And so you have like the criteria that matters the most for small firms and large firms. What are these three key criteria? The fact that it reduces the time to market to launch an innovation. So I work with a competitor because it allows me to ship faster my product, my innovation. And sometimes it's better to join forces with another competitor to outperform a third one. You see, so you want to be the first in the market, the best way to do it, work with a competitor. It allows me also to reduce my costs. And it also provides me good learning opportunities. These are the key benefits that are important for firms when they work with a competitor. There are other ones, but these are like the top three ones. Time to market reduction, cost reduction, and amazing learning opportunities. Are we good so far? Okay, so the question now is, how do we manage the tension stemming from co-opetition strategy? Because you have to understand that co-opetition is a kind of paradoxical strategy, and it's characterized by high risks of opportunism. There's, how to put it, it's a kind of temptation to limit your participation, the value creation, while trying to capture the maximum value. In other words, if we come back to our cake, you want the other partner to invest everything in the cooperation to have like the largest cake as possible, and you on your side, you keep resources to get the largest slice. But your competitor is intelligent. He knows that you are thinking this. And so on his side, he will say, in that case, I will not invest resource in increasing the size of the cake. I will keep everything to get the largest slice as well. And if you do this, nobody creates value. And everybody wants to capture value of a very, very tiny cake. And it's like a lose-lose situation, if you want. So you don't want to do this. So again, the challenge will be, how can I invest in increasing the size of the cake, and how much resources should I keep to like getting the largest slice? So it will create like many tensions. For instance, knowledge tensions. And I would say it's kind of my favorite one. And we've been working on this tension with Anne-Sophie Fernandez. So we've been working, for instance, in the satellite manufacturing industry. Okay, and you had like these two firms, Airbus on one side and Thales on the other side. These are two intense competitors, okay, fierce competitors. And they decided to work together because it was the only way for them to actually get a contract against the US. So they got the contract, they were super happy. And they had to develop this new generation of satellite. None of them could do this alone because they didn't have the entire know-how on how to do this. So they needed to work together. So they decided to put like engineers, technology, and so on, like all these bricks together. And that worked quite well. At the same time, there were still other call for tenders for additional satellites. So Airbus and Thales were still competitors in parallel. So they had to cooperate on this project, and at the same time, they were competing on other projects. And so the engineers, for instance, at Airbus, they knew that they had to share information with their colleagues from Thales, but they knew that if they shared too much information, this information could be used for other projects on which they are in competition. So let's say I give you technology, for instance, for your GPS or your gyroscopic system in your satellite. But if I give you all the information about it, it will be great because our common project will be better. But you might use this information in another project on which we are in competition. So I have to give information, but not too much. So there's this super interesting tension about what should I keep for myself, what should I share with my competitor. Other types of tensions, for instance, are like governance tensions. The fact that you have like these two firms, again, Airbus and Thales, they are only they are working on this joint satellite with one customer. And both want to be the firm interacting with the customer because it's important for them in terms of signal, especially for future contracts, because this customer will want to maybe work in the future with one of them. So they are competing to be the one in contact with the customer. So they had to settle all of these agreements in the contract. And again, they had to divide the task. What should you do? Should you work on this propelling system? Should you work on the gyroscopic system and so on? So you had like to split the task, and some of them are more interesting than others. And some of them are like more cost generating than others. So how do you split them? And of course, it generated financial tensions. Like, okay, we have to build the customer for this part of the satellite. So what are your costs so that I can make a common bill to the customer? Do you think that you will really give your real costs to your competitors? If you do this, your competitor will be able to know perfectly your cost structure for projects that take place in parallel for which you are in competition. So you have to be transparent, but you don't want to be transparent at the same time. So again, you see, you have like to find this kind of right balance. And of course, you have like many other operational tensions, like cultural tensions that can happen, especially like in cases of co-opetition between firms that are from different countries, for instance. And also it can generate conflicts between individuals. You have to understand that these guys at Airbus, for instance, they were working with Thales. And when they were going to the cafeteria for lunch, for instance, or during the weekends, they would meet other colleagues from Airbus. And the guys would say, why are you working with Thales? Thales is our competitor. You should not be working with them. You should not be working with these engineers. They are our enemies. You are like a traitor because you are working with them. So you see, it creates a lot of individual tensions also for these people. So when you have tensions, what you do, you try to manage them. And so over the years, 3 kind of big principles have been identified. The first one is the separation principle. So the idea is to say that, well, individuals, they are not able of integrating the paradox. And if I tell you that you have to cooperate and compete with someone at the same time, you'll probably go completely crazy. So the best way to solve this tension is to say, well, actually, in my company, I will have people that will only cooperate, and I will have people that will only compete. That's more or less the best way to proceed. So the ones that cooperate, they cooperate 100% of their time, and they don't really think about the competition. And the ones that compete, they only compete, and they don't really care about the rest. And that's the best way to make sure that individuals, they survive through this complex situation. The big thing is that at one moment, you have a manager at the top. And so this manager has like one business unit that compete, another one that cooperates. And so is the one who has to make trade-offs, saying, okay, we have to be careful about this information, we can share it, and so on. And these individuals, they need to develop what has been called the integration principles. So it's the fact that you have individuals that are able to integrate these constraints and transcend the paradox. So the guys, they will have like intelligent ways of thinking co-opetition. They will say, okay, we have to share this information, let's share it, but maybe we will share it in a transformed way, for instance, like in an aggregated way, so that we share the information, but our competitor cannot reverse engineer the information and doesn't know how we got it. So you see, you have intelligent ways of sharing stuff that cannot be used, integrated by your competitors beyond the common project. You will just give the result, for instance, of your algorithm, but not the algorithm itself. You see, you have ways of sharing elements like this. And so these are the people that have like this kind of tricky mind, are actually the ones that have like these integration principles. And then you have a last principle called the co-management principle. It's the fact that you will create specific structures to manage tensions between partners. And the best way to do this is actually to replicate all of the different positions with a position from each of the two co-competitors. And by doing this, the two managers, they will kind of watch the other ones, and they will make sure that there are no unintended spillovers, to put things simply. So I will just maybe skip these ones because I feel that I'm already quite late in terms, but so you have like different types of project structures that exist. The cooperative project team that works quite well for radical innovation. It's very expensive because you have to make sure that for each position you have like one person for each co-competitor. It works when the team is co-located, co-governed. It creates a lot of new value because like all the engineers, for instance, are put together in the same building. But also it generates a lot of risk because they can like share information and so on. So it's great for radical innovation, but it's very expensive. So you might want to use it only when you look for relevant for radical innovation. By contrast, the separate project team, in that case, each company works on a site and they have like only limited interfaces. It's great because you don't have so many risks in terms of transfer of knowledge from one team to the other, but at the same time, you don't really create new value, new knowledge together. So it's less costly, but it will only work for incremental innovation when you don't have like to create properly new value. And of course, there have been like research over the last years about how to develop like dedicated information systems, specific reporting systems, like new contractual governance, or even dedicated working spaces. It's super interesting, but you put together people that will be working in the same building, in the same offices during several years sometimes, and they are competitors at the same time. I mean, after a few months, they almost forget that they are competitors. They share much more, many more things with their competitors with which they work every day than with their actual colleagues that are in other buildings. So you see, it raises many, many interesting questions, even in the way we organize space for co-opetition. Regarding co-opetition, so it has some very interesting impacts in terms of performance. And of course, from a theoretical standpoint, you understand that by combining the advantages of cooperation and competition, it should provide you higher levels of performance because you combine both advantages, so it works quite well. But is it really true from an empirical standpoint? And the answer is that it's kind of contrasted. You have like the major part of the papers who say that co-opetition work quite well and has a positive impact on like the economic performance, financial performance, market shares, innovation, prices, time to the market. So you have like a an overall positive impact. But you have some other contributions that find a neutral or a negative impact. So the real challenge right now is not to say whether co-opetition is good or not, is to understand what are the boundary conditions, or are there like moderating variables that explain why co-opetition works better in some circumstances than in other ones. So for instance, the industry characteristics are a very important moderating variable, and it has been shown that co-opetition has a stronger impact in some specific industries, like the ones with a stronger level of uncertainty, for instance, and in that case, you will work with a competitor to share risks, for instance, or when you are in an industry in which you have like network externalities, because you will have an incentive to be the largest on the market, and the best way to be the largest is to put resources with your in common with your competitor to provide, for instance, the largest offer or the largest network. Partner characteristics are also important, and it seems that co-opetition works a bit better, for instance, for smaller firms. So at least it has a stronger impact, stronger positive impact for small firms compared to large firms. And it also works a bit better when your competitor is geographically distant. And our understanding of this result is because when you are distant, you reduces the risks or the tensions stemming from co-opetition. And of course, the alliance portfolio characteristics. So the alliance portfolio, for the ones who are not familiar, is the fact that a firm may have like different alliances at the same time. And the question is, should we only have agreements, competitive agreements? Should we only have co-opetition, or should we have like alliances with other types of firms that are not competitors? And it appears that there's a kind of optimal share of co-opetition in an alliance portfolio. Put differently, do not only rely on co-opetition. Co-opetition is great, but it's not the solution to all of your problems, okay? So you have to have some kind of optimal share of co-opetition. A significant part of your alliances will be with competitors, but you will still have alliances with suppliers, customers, universities, and so on. So do not do 100% of your alliances with competitors. So these are like these kind of moderating variables. And finally, last but not least, the current debates and research directions in the field. Because of course, as you can guess, even if many things have been done about co-opetition over the last decades, there are still many things that remain to be done. So we currently have like very interesting debates regarding the boundaries of co-opetition. Like one of the current debate is cooperating with potential competitors a situation of co-opetition? For instance, there are some firms that work together. They are not competitors, but they might become competitors in the future. But we are not sure that they will actually become one. So our position, and again, it's based on this paper with Frédéric Leroy and Sophie Fernandez, is that it's not really a good way of proceeding. Why? Because first, it's very hard to define what a potential competitor is. Would you think that 15 years ago, we would have guessed that Amazon would be able to launch satellites and rockets? You don't know what Apple will be doing in the next 15 years. So, or what Uber will be doing in the next year. So it's very hard to define what a potential competitor is, and what will be the markets in which a firm will be present in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So it's hard to define. And second, when a firm is not your competitor or your current competitor, you have no incentive to outperform this partner. Second, and it's a big question, can co-opetition be extended to vertical relationships? And again, our position is to say yes, but in very specific conditions. Actually, co-opetition can happen between like firms that are in a vertical relationship if the two firms are if they actually compete for the same customers. Put differently, there's this kind of misunderstanding between conflict and competition. And remember, competition means that you are selling the same kind of products to the same customers. And people tend to apply this co-opetition lens to conflictual situations. And actually, a conflictual situation doesn't yield the same type of dynamics as competition. So it's important to address these issues quite carefully. And then it raises a very interesting, almost philosophical question. Can co-opetition be extended to situations in which actors compete for something other than customers? And in our position, we tend to say, again, it's not a good idea. And let me try to understand you. In any type of relationship between humans, individuals, organizations, companies, there are always conflicts. So conflicts, they are everywhere. And if we integrate this idea of conflict in the definition of co-opetition, it means that any situation, I don't know, between two brothers, for instance, whatever, could be apprehended through the concept of co-opetition. And so if co-opetition can be applied to any relationship, in that case, it means that co-opetition is not a specific lens or a specific framework to analyze a situation. And so if co-opetition works everywhere, it means that it works nowhere. It's super important, but if you think that co-opetition is everywhere, it means that it has nothing specific. And if it has nothing specific, it means that it's not relevant to analyze situations. So this is why we are very reluctant to extend co-opetition to cases that are almost co-opetition, but not so much co-opetition, because by doing this, we are actually destroying the concept of co-opetition itself. Regarding the outcomes of competition, one of the questions actually at the beginning of the presentation was, is it really beneficial and for whom? And yes, co-opetition generates a lot of superior performance, but it works better in some conditions than in others. For instance, it works better for incremental innovation than radical innovation. It works for, there are like these contingency variables. But it's important when you think about performance to think performance for whom. For instance, in one of our research regarding these real estate agencies in France, we've seen that co-opetition works super well for real estate agencies and for the owners of the apartments. Put differently, because of co-opetition, the owners could sell their apartments more quickly and at a higher price. So that's perfect. Superior commercial performance. You sell your apartment at a more expensive price, at a higher price, and more quickly. But you can think about the other side of the coin, saying that actually, in that case, co-opetition destroys value for customers, for consumers, for you, me, when we are buying an apartment. So again, creating value is interesting, but the question is, what about the other stakeholders? Same thing. There's a researcher in South Africa that works, for instance, on the non-financial benefits of co-opetition. When you have two firms that work together to avoid wasting resources, for instance. In that case, it doesn't generate so much financial performance, but it generates a lot of performance for the environment. So you see, we have to think differently, and there's a lot of things about this topic to be done. Is it always the most relevant strategy for firms? We already talked about it, but yes, co-opetition is great, but it can be harmful if you only do co-opetition. So you have to be careful, and co-opetition works in some conditions better than others. So you have to mix it if you want in your portfolio of relationships. And co-opetition is great, but as I was saying, it generates a lot of tensions. And so co-opetition does not automatically lead higher performance. It can actually destroy value much more than it creates value. So we have to be quite careful when you launch a co-opetition strategy. If you launch a co-opetition strategy, you have to think Okay, but how will I manage the tensions? If you don't do this, it's very risky and you might win or lose, but there's a very high chance that you will lose. So when you think co-opetition, you have to think about, okay, but how will I manage co-opetition? And last one, if we zoom out and take a bit more a distance with the current debate, is it a kind of dominant strategy for industries and firms? Put differently, because there are more and more firms that use co-opetition strategies and there are many more industries that use co-opetition strategies, is it a necessary strategy for an industry to emerge, for instance? Is it more relevant in some phases of an industry life cycle? Is it mandatory to do co-opetition for a firm to survive? And these are completely unanswered questions. But these are questions that are emerging and for which we are waiting for researchers such as you to provide us insights. So we count on you. And last one, because of course you are researchers, but you are also, or you will be also teachers, professors. And it raises a super interesting question, is that should students and executives be trained for co-opetition? And if so, how? And our position is to say yes, because actually having a kind of co-opetitive mindset is not something that you get born with, okay? It only works through your past professional experiences or mostly through all the things that you learn about co-opetition. These principles, the tools, the organizational designs, and so on, you don't have them in mind. You don't discover them. Actually, it's better if you teach them, if you learn them in books or in classes and so on. So it's the only way for us to make sure that co-opetition is managed properly. If you want to go further and if it has actually met your expectations, we have written, so with Anne-Sophie Fernandez, Frédéric Leroy, and Wojciech Czak in Poland, a book in 2018 called The Routledge Companion to Co-Opetition Strategies. Actually, when I said we wrote a book, I'm not completely sure. Actually, there are 37 chapters, and these chapters, they have been written by the leading scholars every time on their topic. So all the different authors that I've cited throughout my slide, they have all written chapters in it. And every time, so on each specific co-opetition topic, they present the existing literature, so they take stock of the existing literature on the topic, they highlight the current debates, the question, and they also raise, and this is super interesting for you, directions for future research. So I hope it answers your different questions that you may have about co-opetition. I'm looking forward to exchanging with all of you about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chiambaretto. And actually now we have amazing opportunity to start questions and answer session. If you have any question, you just need to put them in the chat and we will read them. And of course, you can unmute yourself and ask any questions you want.
I will stop sharing my slides so that I can see your faces.
Thank you very much. Yeah, here you go. I'm still thinking about this unanswered question, is the co-opetition the next evolution phase? So I do understand that there is no answer for that, but now I'm having that in my mind. Okay, Halina Zaporozhets is asking the question. Thank you for your presentation. How do you think the co-opetition should or can work at the university, the impact of co-opetition on the university as you see it?
Alina, this is a super interesting question, and I really like it because actually, in addition to studying co-opetition, we are practicing co-opetition at Montpellier. At Montpellier, you have to understand that we have two institutions for teaching and education, and Anna has seen it. You have the University of Montpellier, which is a public institution, and we have Montpellier Business School, which is a private institution. And I'm actually from Montpellier Business School, the private institution. And these two institutions, they realized that alone, they were doing some great things, but they were not very competitive. And they could not get like funds for research and so on. And so a few years back, the deans of the university and of Montpellier Business School decided to work together and to create a common research lab called Montpellier Research in Management, to put together their research teams to be attractive and large enough on the marketplace. And this research lab is actually now the largest lab in France. And at the same time, so they cooperate a lot on research, and at the same time, these two institutions, they compete to get the best students. So actually, Montpellier is an amazing example of co-opetition. We cooperate on the research side and we compete on the teaching side simultaneously. I don't know if it answers your question, but it's a good illustration of co-opetition in the higher education system.
Okay, I think Halina is happy with the answer, right?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. I see you smiling. Anyone else? Please encourage you to go. Janice is having a hand. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry, I would like to ask it in by voice. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this presentation. It's very interesting. I would like to know if you could share maybe the title of the article about the non-financial benefits of co-opetition.
Yes, absolutely. I will even so it's a 2016 paper, and there's in the handbook the author is Jako. Let me change. I will put the slide on the reference in the chat.
Okay, thanks.
So that you have it. And he has also written a chapter in the handbook as well about this dimension. So
okay, thanks. Thank you. But that wasn't my question. Because earlier on you mentioned that competition has a stronger effect on smaller firms. Is that in the setting or where there is a competition strategy between two small firms or a small and a large firm? Because I can imagine, or that there's competition.
Again, it's a very interesting question, this question of size asymmetry between the partners. Currently, what we know about it is, so it was like, so the paper in itself was based on the CIS database, so the Community Innovation Survey, which is like a big European database, and in which you don't know the size of your partner. So it was, so they didn't have like insights about it. But there are currently new emerging research that are addressing the size imbalance between co-opetitors, because you are perfectly right. When you're a small firm and you are working with a very large firm, there's the high chance that the very large firm might take all the value out of this cake. So that's there's a growing debate right now about the how small and large firms, how small and large competitors can work together. And we have been working on it. So if it's something that interests you, just send me an email. There's my email address, and I'll be very happy to give you some examples of papers about it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I've put the references in the slides of the 2016 paper.
Okay, thank you very much, Janice, for your question. Okay, we have a question from Mohamed Abida. Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. Oh my God, you're challenging me, right? I would like to ask if competition can be implemented between students too, and do you think that they can manage it or not? Thanks again.
It depends. I mean, you can create like a co-opetition between students for like a project, for instance, like to learn how co-opetition works. You can do like experiments like this for a class, but let's think about your question. So let's think about our three conditions. I don't know if you remember them. Co-opetition requires intense competition, intense cooperation, and cooperation and competition must take place simultaneously. How do students compete? That's my question.
I don't think that we have limitation in our good grades, Professor Chiambaretto, and Mohammed knows that pretty well. If you do your job, you're going to have an A, right?
The only way you could say that they compete would be, for instance, for a job offer. That could
Absolutely.
be a way.
Yes.
So you have like in your group of students for your master's degree, for instance, like think a way of understanding co-opetition strategy would be to say that you have like a group of students who understand that they are competing for the same job offers. And so to avoid this situation, they decided to create a job fair and to increase the size of the, and to be more attractive as a group, for instance, and attract more potential employers, and to say that, hey, we exist, and by doing this, they will create more opportunities. But again, you see, it's when you think about co-opetition like this, you begin to get away from the pure definition of co-opetition. There's co-opetition works if you are really competing for something. And there's this debate, and I'm part of the ones who have like this kind of strict definition of co-opetition, but I have many other colleagues that do not agree on this. They would say, yes, of course, it's co-opetition, so there's no right or wrong answer. But on a pure vision, it would not be co-opetition. On a broad vision, you could say that, yes, because you are competing for some job offers, there are like tensions among you, and you want to attract a firm to say, okay, we will welcome to our job fair, but you take the risk of giving your job offer to one of your classmates. So it creates tensions between, should I keep the job offer for myself or should I share it with the rest of the class? But it's not real co-opetition for us. I don't know if it answers your question. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohammed. I would add a little bit, because I think we don't have a pure competition, but we have a pool of scholarship for the students of Ukraine. So I think they compete at least once in a year when they try to, compare the year. Yeah, once in a year, but it's not simultaneously process. And of course, the individual efforts matters a lot. So I think that one of the factors of competition, it means that we have limited resources or limited market share, right? And there is no limitation for the grades, I mean.
No, but the question for you would be to say, okay, in that case, using your example for the scholarship, should I work with one of the best students? So I am a very good student in your class. Should I work with one of the other best students? So that together we get the best grade. So it increases my chance to get the scholarship, but it also increases the chance of my strongest competitor to get the scholarship. And so the question is, okay, we work together on this topic, but on another discipline, on another work, I will have to outperform my partner / competitor to make sure that I get the scholarship and not him. You see, so, and in the end, this is what would make you the best student, because not only you have to be good on the common project, but at the same time, in parallel, you want to be better than him on the other project. And this is why you have to be, so again, this co-opetition thing works only if you have this willingness to outperform your competitor every time.
A lot of tension, I would say. Okay, so if the faculty is giving award for the first class students, is it not a form of competition? I think we already covered that on previous analogy. Of course, that will create additional tension, I would say.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. Anyone? Yeah. Anyone else? Please go ahead with your questions. I was a little bit confused with this how to say it, limitation of the competition. So for those firms that were competitors, but the markets were not overlapped very intensively, but they tried to reduce the competitive pressure and they became partners in some kind of a project, and then it's called like strategic alliances.
Yeah.
And they still try to target the same audiences, but they already have the collaboration that you're taking the East market, I'm taking the West market. It's still a competition, or cooperation, collaboration, more like project?
This is a super interesting question, actually, because one of the conditions that we detail much more in the paper is to say that this cooperation should not aim at eliminating the competition. And that, because you have to understand that coopetition means that you have competitors that work together, and many competition authorities are very careful about this kind of behaviors because they see that it's kind of a cartel, if you want, like. And so in that case, when you have competitors that decide to work together to set higher prices or to limit the quantities, in that case, it's something that is not allowed. So this is why actually firms, they don't want to talk so much about coopetition, because it gives them the impression that, well, as soon as they talk about coopetition, they risk being accused of creating a cartel. So to be in presence of coopetition, you have to make sure that the cooperation does not lead to the end of competition. Cooperation must be a way to develop something new that none of you could have created. And so if by doing this, you actually strengthen future competition. Think about the Airbus and Thales example. It's not because they have worked together on this satellite that they were not competing on the other projects. Samsung and Apple, they work together on the iPhone and so on, but they are still fierce competitors. By contrast, if Apple and Samsung decided to only work together and to create only one type of smartphone and put an end to the competition between Apple and Samsung, in that case, what would they do would be forbidden. You see, so there's always this thing about showing that what you do in coopetition does not destroy future competition. Otherwise, it's illegal.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have a question in voice from Richmal Baba. Yes. Please go on.
I cannot hear you apparently.
Unmute myself. Unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, I have two forms of questions.
Yes.
My first question is on the cooperation you are talking about.
Yes.
Doesn't it lead to a form of monopoly?
That's a risk. If you only have like two firms that work together, and of course it would create a kind of monopoly, but the key thing about coopetition is that you have to maintain a high level of competition. And so in the end, these two firms, even if they work together, in the end, they have to offer separate products. Samsung and Sony, they jointly developed these LCD standards for televisions, but in the end, you were selling either a Sony screen or a Samsung screen. You didn't, and they were competing fiercely to make sure that Sony or Samsung would have the largest market share. So they would change the design, they would change tiny things to make sure that the Sony television is better than the Samsung one, for instance. So there's always this risk of going towards a monopoly, but it's something that we want to avoid as much as possible. Otherwise, when you reach a monopoly like this, you get condemned by these competition authorities, and it's something that should be avoided as much as possible. I hope it answers the question.
Yeah, I guess so. So it means that the cooperation should be monitored. Is that what you are saying? I don't know whether I'm really getting.
The idea is to say that even
for example, if Samsung is producing the screens, and then Apple is producing another part, then it means that Samsung is competing from a different angle. So Samsung is producing probably screen, and so he's competing with the market that are selling the screen. So in this case, Samsung is not directly competing with Apple, because Apple is producing a different part of the software or the hardware.
In the end, the competition will work only if you are able to sell the same type of final product.
That's what I'm trying to say. So it means that when there's a cooperation, there should be kind of monitoring. Other than that, it might lead to monopoly. That is, I don't know whether.
No, because you need to make sure that you keep other products on the site on which you are competing.
Okay.
So even if you create a joint product, you can create a joint product. The two firms, they will have to keep working as competitors for other products in their line.
Okay. All right. Then my second thing is, I think some level of competition among students is needed.
Yes.
Yeah, because for example, I asked whether if a faculty is giving an award for a first-class student, is it not a competition? And then we're saying it's a tension. But I think that a level of competition will bring perfection from the student. And so if we encourage some kind of competition among our students, it will bring their talent and their skills out. So I think that some level of competition among students should be tolerated. I don't know. I stand to be corrected.
I agree. It's the thing is that we use the same term competition to describe different things: a market relationship and a personal relationship. And so a market relationship is the one that you could have between two organizations, two firms. And when you talk about competition, to characterize personal relationships, it's much more conflict. And conflict means that I have something that you do not have. And so there's one thing to share, and I have it and you don't have it. So and competition and conflict, they don't rely on the same mechanisms. There are some similarities, and you're right, and this is why some people think that we should apply co-opetition to individual relationships. But the symmetry is not perfect, I would say. And so this is why it's always risky when the symmetry is not perfect to make like this kind of copy and paste in terms of principles and so on, because it does not always work. Or at least we have to be careful when saying, okay, we can replicate what we do for firms for individuals.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. And Janice has another one. Please go ahead.
Yes, my question is more related now in the context of research, because there seems to be a little bit of a competition of being cited and of publishing. And in parallel, there's also the mental health issues and well-being that is also emerging from in this context. So I have a bit of a mixed feelings of competing in research, because to me it is about advancing knowledge, or the body of knowledge, rather than being published or cited. So what are your thoughts on competition among researchers?
I would say it's more or less the same thing as competition among students. Again, for individual relationships, I'm not sure it applies perfectly well, but it's true because it would work, for instance, if you had like, okay, you have like two junior professors, okay, like two assistant professors. They are both in a tenure track, and only one tenure is provided at the end of the year. So only one of them could become associate professor, for instance. And they know that, so they are actually in competition for this tenured position. And they know that if they want to, so if both of them work alone, none of them would actually get the position, but they decide to work together on a paper and publish jointly so that they both meet the requirements to be tenured. Okay, and yes, that could be a way to describe a situation of co-opetition between researchers. They cooperate on a project to create more value, but in the end, they will still be competing to get the position. But I'm not sure that it generates a superior performance. You see, the question is, what is the interest of calling it co-opetition? I would say, does it generate more insights to call something co-opetition? I mean, to be completely honest with you, co-opetition is a super trendy concept. So it means that if you use co-opetition in a paper, I wouldn't say there's a higher chance, but it's a trendy concept. It's a highly cited concept. So it means that people in that case will say, if I use the word co-opetition, there's a high chance that my paper will be accepted and then cited. But the question is, beyond this pure material aspect, what is the added value of studying a relationship co-opetition? Co-opetition should be useful if it allows you to pinpoint something specific. To say, okay, it is because it is a co-opetitive relationship that I understand this type of tension. Or it is because it is called co-opetition that I'm able to understand why it generates this kind of performance. So this is why, again, applying co-opetition as a lens, a framework to individual relationships, I'm not completely convinced, but again, it's my personal standpoint at a given moment. I still don't understand what is the value it adds to understand this relationship. I don't know if you get my point, Janice.
Yes, I think I do. I think I do. It's more at individual level that it doesn't. Yeah, it might be a little bit tricky because it creates tensions among individuals.
Yeah, exactly. It works. I mean, some people think that co-opetition is interesting to investigate tensions, I would say. And I think what makes co-opetition interesting is the fact that it's counterintuitive. It's the fact that to have more performance, you need to go to your worst enemy, because your worst enemy is actually your better ally to develop more performance. I think that makes the co-opetition strategy attractive for a researcher. Saying, but why would I go with my worst enemy to do something? And you have like many examples of co-opetition like this. You have co-opetition between countries, for instance, or I mean, you have to. I mean, and so you say, okay, maybe it is in my interest to work with my best enemy to do something that I could not have done alone. That makes co-opetition interesting. And so between individuals, it could be, it is in my interest to work with my worst enemy to make sure that I get qualified for my tenure. Okay. But the question is then, what would be the tensions that it would generate in that case? And in the end, at my individual level, will it increase my performance? And at the organizational level, for instance, at the level of my lab, will it increase my performance as well? It's an ongoing, I mean, and this is why I've put it in the debates part. It's because, one, we don't know if there's one right answer on this, and second, we don't all agree on the topic. So that's make it fascinating, because it's we don't know yet if we have to apply it at the individual level, and if we do, how actually. What are the elements that we should replicate from one thing to the other? Think about the management principles: separation, integration, and co-management. How can I apply the separation principle to myself? You see, the integration principle, I vaguely see how I can do this, but what about the other principles? I cannot like split myself into two with just my right arm that will actually cooperate and my left arm that will compete. So you see, and in that case, I will say, okay, maybe I will separate, but from a temporal perspective. On the Monday, I will be cooperative. On the Tuesday, I will be competitive. And on the Wednesday, I will be cooperative, and so on. But if I do this, actually, I'm not simultaneous anymore. So it's not co-opetition. So you see, it raises many. The question is not to say, okay, we stamp on it like saying it's co-opetition. It's not. It's about, okay, if we call it co-opetition, why not? But what are the elements that work at the firm level and how could they be replicated to the individual level, I would say. And to these questions, I don't have the answer, so that makes the challenge even more interesting. I hope it answered your question, Denise.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, anyone else? Do we have any other questions?
I don't know if it answered your expectations, actually, the many expectations we had at the beginning.
Yeah, so we can have this cascade. I think we can do it. So please, dear participants, we are like rolling up our session. Just please type in a chat something remarkable that you will bring with you for the next day. You will wake up in the morning and something that you will still thinking about that came out of this session. Maybe one word or maybe some keywords that you're gonna have in your mind after that. Thank you very much. And we have like several seconds to think and type it. Keywords, something to remember. I do believe that you're still typing and you are just formulating your ideas that you're gonna have. Yay! See, thank you very much.
Yes.
Intense and simultaneous competition and cooperation at the same time between satellites companies. Thank you very much, Mohammed. Okay, thank you. How about researchers, right? Individuals.
By the way, Coopetition is not a religion. You don't have to be converted to Coopetition, okay? So it's not to say that it is better than competition or cooperation, but it's an interesting strategy to investigate.
Okay, thank you very much for that comment and this remark. And we have a lot of thanks and grateful words in the end. And again, thank you very much, Professor Chiambaretto, that you joined this set of the sessions of this professional program. I hope that it's not going to be our last meeting. Of course, it's just the beginning of our cooperation. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to exchange with all of you. And if you have any questions, you have my email on the slide, so just feel free to send me an email and I will be more than happy to try to help you. So thank you very much.